The stagecoach had overturned 3 miles back, leaving Felicity Lawson with nothing but the torn dress on her back and a bruised ankle that screamed with every step she took through the unforgiving Texas dust. She had been traveling west to take a position as a schoolteacher in San Antonio. But now, limping toward what looked like civilization shimmering in the August heat of 1873, she wondered if she would even survive the day. The other passengers had scattered in different directions, each seeking help from whatever town lay nearest, and Felicity had chosen the smoke rising in the distance as her beacon of hope. Her throat burned with thirst, her lips cracked and bleeding, when she finally stumbled into Desdemona, Texas, a rough collection of wooden buildings that looked like they had been thrown together by men too busy surviving to care about aesthetics. She collapsed against the post outside the general store, her vision swimming with dark spots. Through the haze, she saw a massive figure emerge from the livery stable across the dusty street. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun behind him. Dark hair fell past his collar, wild and untamed, framing a face weathered by wind and sun. His arms, bare beneath a leather vest, were corded with muscle that flexed as he carried what looked like an entire saddle in one hand, as though it weighed nothing at all. He stopped mid-stride when he saw her, those sharp eyes assessing her situation in an instant. Felicity tried to speak, but her voice came out as nothing more than a rasp. The world tilted sideways, and she felt herself falling. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground, and she found herself looking up into eyes the color of storm clouds, set in a face that might have been carved from granite. His jaw was square and stubbled, his expression intense as he studied her with concern that surprised her. "Water," she managed to whisper. He did not waste time with questions. Instead, he lifted her as easily as he had carried that saddle, cradling her against a chest that felt like warm stone beneath his worn cotton shirt. She felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat as he strode toward a building with purposeful steps. Within moments, she was being lowered onto a bench inside what appeared to be a small cabin attached to the livery stable. He pressed a tin cup to her lips, supporting her head with one calloused hand. "Slow," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through her. "Too fast and you will be sick." Felicity obeyed, taking small sips of the coolest, sweetest water she had ever tasted. As her vision cleared, she got her first proper look at the man who had rescued her. He knelt before her, those massive shoulders hunched to bring himself to her level, studying her with an intensity that should have frightened her, but somehow did not. His face was all hard angles and weathered skin, the face of a man who had spent years in the wilderness. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a dangerous look that was contradicted by the gentle way he held the cup to her lips. "Stagecoach overturned," Felicity said when she could finally speak properly. 3 miles back, maybe more. I walked." His expression darkened. "In this heat? You're lucky to be alive." He stood, his full height making the small cabin seem even smaller. "My name is Fletcher Grant. I'm the blacksmith here, but I know mountains and wilderness better than most. You need food and rest." "Felicity Lawson," she replied, trying to stand but gasping when her ankle gave way beneath her. Fletcher caught her again, this time lowering her back to the bench with careful hands that seemed too gentle for someone so large and powerful. "Let me see," he said, already kneeling to examine her ankle. His fingers probed the swollen joint with surprising tenderness, and despite the pain, Felicity found herself noticing the sheer size of his hands, the way they could probably crush stone, but touched her as though she were made of glass. "Not broken, but badly twisted. You need to stay off it for several days." "I cannot," Felicity protested. "I'm supposed to be in San Antonio. I have a position waiting, a teaching position. They are expecting me." Fletcher looked up at her, those storm-gray eyes holding hers. "They will have to wait. You push yourself now, you will do permanent damage. Besides, Desdemona has been needing a teacher for 2 years now. Maybe fate brought you here instead." Something in the way he said it, in the quiet hope she heard beneath those gruff words, made her heart skip. She studied him more carefully, noting the intelligence in his eyes, the way he carried himself with confidence born of competence rather than arrogance. This was not just some rough laborer. This was a man who had chosen this life, who had skills and knowledge that went far beyond shoeing horses. "Tell me about yourself," she said, needing to fill the silence as he wrapped her ankle with strips of clean cloth he retrieved from a wooden chest in the corner. Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady as he worked. "Not much to tell that matters. Grew up in the Rockies with my father, who was a trapper. Learned to survive in places that would kill most men. My mother died when I was young. Fever took her. When my father passed 5 years ago, I came down here. Figured I would try living among people for a change. Turns out I'm decent with a forge, and Desdemona needed a blacksmith." He tied off the bandage and sat back on his heels. "That is the simple version." "And the complicated version?" Felicity asked, surprised by her own boldness. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, transforming his harsh features into something almost handsome. "The complicated version is that I am not good with words or people, but I am good with my hands, and I keep my promises. I own this land, the livery, and a cabin up in the hills where I go when town gets too crowded. I am honest. I work hard, and I do not suffer fools." His eyes met hers again. "And I have never met anyone quite like you, Miss Lawson." Heat flooded Felicity's cheeks, and not from the Texas sun. Before she could respond, the door burst open, and a small, wiry man with a sheriff's star pinned to his vest rushed in, followed by a woman in a practical calico dress. "Fletcher, we heard you brought in someone from that overturned stage," the sheriff said, then stopped when he saw Felicity. "Madam, I am Sheriff Daniels. This is Mrs. Whitmore, who runs the boarding house. We sent riders to check on the others from your coach." "Are they all right?" Felicity asked anxiously. "Scraped and shaken, but alive," Mrs. Whitmore said, coming forward with a kind smile. "You look like you got the worst of it, dear. Come on, let me get you settled in a proper room with a real bed." Fletcher stood, his expression unreadable. "She needs to stay off that ankle completely. Doctor should look at it when he gets back from the Patterson Ranch." "I will take good care of her," Mrs. Whitmore assured him, then turned to Felicity. "Can you walk if you lean on me?" "I can carry her," Fletcher said before Felicity could answer. Once again she found herself lifted into those impossibly strong arms, held against that solid chest. She caught the scent of him, wood smoke and leather, and something uniquely masculine that made her pulse quicken. He carried her out into the blazing afternoon sun, and she noticed the way people stopped to stare, the way the women whispered behind their hands, and the men nodded respectfully to Fletcher. The boarding house was a 2-story structure that actually looked well-maintained compared to some of the other buildings. Fletcher carried her up the stairs without showing any sign of strain, following Mrs. Whitmore to a small but clean room with a window overlooking the main street. He set Felicity down on the bed with the same careful gentleness he had shown before. "Thank you," Felicity said softly, looking up at him. "You saved my life." Fletcher's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might say something important. Instead, he just nodded once and turned toward the door. "I will check on you tomorrow," he said, then was gone, his heavy footsteps receding down the stairs. Mrs. Whitmore chuckled as she began helping Felicity out of her torn and dusty dress. "Well now, I have known Fletcher Grant for 5 years, and I have never seen him act quite like that around anyone. You must have made quite an impression." "He was just being kind," Felicity protested, but she felt her cheeks warming again. "Fletcher is many things, but he is not just kind to anyone," Mrs. Whitmore said knowingly. "He keeps to himself mostly, comes to town to work and buy supplies, then disappears back to his cabin in the hills. Some of the ladies have tried to catch his attention, but he barely seems to notice they exist. Yet, he could not take his eyes off you." Felicity wanted to dismiss the notion, but she remembered the way Fletcher had looked at her, the intensity in those gray eyes. She was not naive. At 22 years old, she had received attention from men before. But there had been something different about Fletcher Grant, something that went beyond mere physical attraction. He had looked at her like she mattered, like she was something precious he needed to protect. Over the next 3 days, Felicity found herself thinking about him far more than she should. Mrs. Whitmore brought her meals and helped her with washing and dressing, keeping her ankle elevated as Fletcher had instructed. The doctor, an elderly man named Henderson, confirmed that Fletcher's assessment and treatment had been exactly right, and that she should make a full recovery if she was patient. Fletcher came every evening, always carrying something. The first night, he brought a pair of crutches he had fashioned himself, perfectly sized for her height. The second night, he brought a book of poetry he had found among his father's belongings, thinking she might enjoy something to pass the time. The third night, he brought wildflowers he had picked from the hills, their purple and yellow blooms brightening the small room. They talked during those visits, awkward at first, but growing easier as they discovered unexpected common ground. Felicity told him about growing up in Boston, about losing her parents to cholera, and deciding to start fresh in the West. Fletcher told her about life in the mountains, about tracking animals and reading weather in the clouds, about the profound silence of a winter forest. She found herself fascinated by the contrast between his rough exterior and the thoughtful, observant mind beneath. "You have never been inside a church, have you?" she asked on the fourth evening, the question arising from something he had said about Sundays being just like any other day to him. Fletcher looked startled by the question. "No," he admitted. "My father was not a religious man, and there were no churches in the mountains. I know about God and Jesus from books I have read, but I have never attended a service." "Would you like to?" Felicity asked, surprised by her own boldness. "Mrs. Whitmore says there is a small church here in Desdemona, and services are held every Sunday. When my ankle is better, perhaps we could go together. It would be your first time and my first time attending services in Texas. We could be nervous together." Something shifted in Fletcher's expression, a softening around his eyes that made her breath catch. "I would like that," he said quietly. "I would like that very much." The way he looked at her when he said it made Felicity's heart race. There was hope in his eyes, and something deeper, something that both thrilled and terrified her. She barely knew this man, yet she felt drawn to him in a way she had never experienced before. Perhaps it was gratitude for his rescue, or perhaps it was something more, something she was not quite ready to name. By the end of the first week, Felicity could hobble around on her crutches, though her ankle still ached if she put too much weight on it. She had sent a telegram to the school board in San Antonio, explaining her situation and asking if the position was still available. Their response had been understanding but firm. They had hired someone else, as they could not afford to wait indefinitely. The news should have devastated her, but instead, Felicity felt a strange sense of relief, as though fate had indeed redirected her path. Sheriff Daniels had tracked down her trunk, which had been recovered from the overturned stagecoach, and Fletcher had carried it up to her room without being asked. That evening, as she sorted through her belongings and found most of them intact, there was a soft knock on her door. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Whitmore. Instead, Fletcher filled the doorway, his hat in his hands. He looked nervous, she realized with surprise. This massive, capable man who could survive alone in the wilderness looked genuinely uncertain. "The school board sent their reply to the telegraph office," he said. "Word travels fast in a small town. I heard they gave your position away." "Yes," Felicity confirmed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I suppose I need to decide what to do next." Fletcher stepped into the room, his presence seeming to fill every available space. "Stay," he said simply. "Desdemona needs a teacher. The children here have been learning what they can from their parents, but it is not the same as having someone dedicated to it. The town council will pay you, and Mrs. Whitmore says you can stay here as long as you need." "Is that what you want?" Felicity asked, meeting his eyes. "For me to stay?" Fletcher moved closer, and she could see the muscle working in his jaw as he struggled with words. "Yes," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you to stay. These past days, talking with you have been... I cannot explain it properly. I just know that the thought of you leaving, of never seeing you again, feels wrong." Felicity stood, balancing carefully on her good foot. She was tall for a woman, but she still had to tilt her head back to look up at him. "I feel it too," she admitted. "This connection between us. It frightens me because it is so sudden, so unexpected." "Nothing worthwhile is ever safe," Fletcher said, and one of his large hands came up to cup her cheek with devastating gentleness. "I am not good with pretty words, Felicity, but I am good at recognizing something valuable when I see it. You are educated and refined, and you deserve better than a rough mountain man who spends his days pounding metal. But if you give me a chance, I swear I will do everything in my power to make you happy." Tears pricked Felicity's eyes at the raw honesty in his words. "You think I care about polish and refinement?" she asked, her hand coming up to cover his where it rested against her face. "I have met plenty of so-called gentlemen in Boston, Fletcher. They had fine manners and fancy words, but they were empty inside. You are real. You are honest and strong and kind, and you make me feel safe in a way I never have before." Fletcher's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear that had escaped. "Then stay," he said again. "Stay and let me court you properly. Let me show you what life can be like here." "Yes," Felicity whispered, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first, but deepening when she responded. His arms came around her, supporting her weight effortlessly, and she felt the restrained power in his embrace. He kissed her like she was precious, like she was a gift he was afraid might vanish, and she found herself clinging to his broad shoulders, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "Sunday," he said, "when your ankle is better. We will go to church together, like you suggested. Your first Sunday in Desdemona, and my first Sunday ever in a church." "I would like that," Felicity said, smiling up at him. "I would like that very much." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of healing and discovery. Felicity's ankle grew stronger each day, and she began meeting with the town council about establishing a proper school. The council was enthusiastic, offering the use of a small building that had once served as a meeting hall. Fletcher spent his evenings helping her clean and prepare the space, building desks and benches with his own hands, crafting a blackboard frame that he mounted on the wall. She marveled at watching him work, at the precision and care he brought to every task. His hands, so large and rough, could create things of surprising beauty and functionality. He would arrive each evening after finishing his work at the livery, often bringing dinner he had cooked himself over his forge fire, and they would eat together before tackling whatever needed to be done for the school. During those quiet hours, Felicity learned more about the man beneath the intimidating exterior. Fletcher was surprisingly well-read, having spent long winter months in mountain cabins with nothing but his father's small library for company. He could quote Shakespeare and discuss philosophy, though he did so with an embarrassed reluctance, as though afraid she would mock him for it. Instead, she treasured these glimpses into his mind, loving the way his face would light up when he talked about books or ideas that fascinated him. He learned about her as well, asking questions about her childhood, her dreams, her fears. She told him about the loneliness of being an orphan, about the strict aunt who had raised her more from duty than affection, about her determination to build a life of purpose and meaning. Fletcher listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard, truly seen, for perhaps the first time in her life. "You are remarkable," he told her one evening as they sat on the steps of the school building, watching the sun paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink. "You lost everything in that stagecoach accident, and instead of falling apart, you turned it into an opportunity. You are braver than you know." "I am terrified most of the time," Felicity admitted, leaning against his shoulder. She had grown comfortable with small touches, with the casual intimacy that had developed between them. "But being with you makes me feel like I can handle anything." Fletcher's arm came around her, pulling her closer against his side. "That is how you make me feel too," he said quietly. "Like maybe I do not have to always be alone, always separate from everyone else. Like maybe I could have something more." As Sunday approached, Felicity found herself growing nervous about attending church services for the first time in her life. It was not that she lacked faith. Her aunt had been religious and had taught Felicity to pray and read the Bible. But formal church services had always seemed intimidating, full of rules and expectations she might not understand. The thought of attending with Fletcher, who would be just as uncertain as she was, made it feel manageable somehow. Saturday evening, Fletcher arrived at the boarding house looking freshly bathed, his long hair clean and tied back, wearing what she realized must be his best shirt, a deep blue cotton that made his eyes seem even more striking. He held a package wrapped in brown paper. "For tomorrow," he said, pressing it into her hands. "I hope it fits." Felicity unwrapped the package to find a beautiful dress of soft green cotton, simple but well made, with delicate buttons down the front. She looked up at Fletcher in surprise. "How did you—" "I asked Mrs. Whitmore about your size," he admitted, his ears turning red. "The seamstress in town owed me a favor. I know your other dresses were ruined in the accident, and I wanted you to have something nice for your first Sunday here." Tears stung Felicity's eyes as she held the dress against herself. "It is perfect," she whispered. "Thank you, Fletcher." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I just want you to feel beautiful," he said gruffly, "though you would be beautiful wearing a flour sack." Felicity laughed, delighted by his awkward attempt at romance. She reached up and pulled his face down to hers, kissing him with all the affection and gratitude she felt. Fletcher responded immediately, his arms wrapping around her waist and lifting her feet clear off the ground as he deepened the kiss. When he finally set her down, they were both flushed and breathless. "Tomorrow," Felicity said softly, "our first Sunday together." Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the August heat already building even in the early hours. Felicity dressed carefully in the green dress Fletcher had given her, pleased to find that it fit perfectly. She pinned her dark hair up in a simple style and splashed rosewater on her wrists, a luxury she had managed to save from her trunk. Her ankle was nearly healed now, only twinged if she moved wrong, and she could walk without the crutches. Fletcher arrived at the boarding house precisely when he said he would, and Felicity's breath caught at the sight of him. He had trimmed his beard, though he kept it full, and wore dark trousers with a white shirt and a black vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His hair was clean and tied back with a leather cord, and he held a black hat in his hands that looked brand new. "You look beautiful," he said when he saw her, his voice carrying that rough sincerity that never failed to move her. "So do you," Felicity replied, then laughed at her own words. "Handsome, I mean. You look very handsome." Fletcher smiled, and she thought again how much it transformed his face. He offered her his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fabric. They walked slowly down the main street of Desdemona, and Felicity noticed people watching them from windows and doorways. She had been the subject of much speculation since her arrival, she knew, and her growing relationship with Fletcher had only intensified the gossip. But she found she did not care what people thought. Let them talk. She had never felt more certain of anything than she did about her feelings for this man. The church was a small wooden building at the edge of town, freshly whitewashed and simple but well maintained. A bell hung in a modest steeple, and it began ringing as they approached, calling the faithful to worship. Felicity felt Fletcher tense beside her, and she squeezed his arm reassuringly. "We face this together," she reminded him softly. "Together," he echoed, and some of the tension left his shoulders. They climbed the 3 steps to the entrance, and Felicity noticed Fletcher looking at everything with intense interest, taking in details most people would miss. The Reverend stood at the door, greeting his congregation, and his eyebrows rose in surprise when he saw Fletcher. "Fletcher Grant," the Reverend said warmly. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair. "I never thought I would see the day you walked through these doors. And this must be Miss Lawson, our new school teacher. Welcome, both of you." "Thank you, Reverend Harris," Felicity said, trying not to let her nervousness show. "This is my first time attending services in Desdemona." "And my first time anywhere," Fletcher added bluntly, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "I mean, in any church. I've never been inside one before." Reverend Harris's expression softened with understanding. "Then you are especially welcome, my son. Please, find a seat wherever you are comfortable." They entered the church, and Felicity was struck by the simple beauty of the space. Wooden pews lined either side of a central aisle, and sunlight streamed through windows on both walls. A simple wooden cross hung behind the pulpit, and wildflowers in mason jars decorated the windowsills. It was humble but felt sacred somehow, peaceful in a way that settled something inside her. Fletcher seemed to sense it too. She felt him relax as they chose a pew near the back, sliding in together. He looked around with open curiosity, taking in the hymnals stacked on a small shelf, the worn wooden floor, the faces of the other congregants who had already arrived. Some of them stared openly at Fletcher, clearly surprised to see him here. Mrs. Whitmore arrived with her husband and gave Felicity an encouraging smile before taking a seat several pews ahead. Sheriff Daniels nodded respectfully to Fletcher as he passed with his family. Slowly, the small church filled with people, perhaps 30 in total, which Felicity guessed was most of Desdemona's population. When everyone was seated, Reverend Harris took his place at the pulpit. "Let us begin with prayer," he said, and everyone bowed their heads. Felicity peeked at Fletcher and found him watching her uncertainly. She bowed her head and reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. Fletcher followed her lead, bowing his own head, and she felt his grip tighten around hers. Reverend Harris's prayer was simple and heartfelt, thanking God for the blessings of community and asking for guidance and strength for the week ahead. Then he led them in singing a hymn, and Felicity was surprised to hear Fletcher's voice beside her, deep and surprisingly musical, though he stumbled over some of the words he clearly did not know. The sermon was about welcoming strangers and showing kindness to those in need, and Felicity could not help but think of how perfectly it applied to her own situation. She had been a stranger in desperate need, and Fletcher had welcomed her without hesitation. As Reverend Harris spoke about Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, demonstrating humble service, she thought of Fletcher's gentle hands bandaging her ankle, his careful attention to her needs. She glanced at Fletcher and found him listening intently to every word, his brow furrowed in concentration. This man who could survive alone in the wilderness, who could bend metal with his bare hands, sat beside her absorbing spiritual teaching with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else. Her heart swelled with affection for him. When the service ended, Reverend Harris invited everyone to stay for refreshments in the small yard beside the church. Felicity expected Fletcher to want to leave immediately, knowing how uncomfortable he could be in social situations, but to her surprise, he seemed willing to stay. "That was not what I expected," Fletcher said quietly as they stood. "I thought it would feel restrictive somehow, full of judgment, but Reverend Harris spoke about love and acceptance. That felt right." "It was beautiful," Felicity agreed. "Thank you for coming with me. I know this was difficult for you." Fletcher looked down at her, his gray eyes intense. "Nothing is difficult when I'm with you," he said simply. They joined the congregation outside, where women had set out cookies and lemonade on wooden tables. Several people approached them, and Felicity was touched by how welcoming everyone seemed. Mrs. Patterson, whose ranch the doctor had been visiting when Felicity first arrived, invited them to dinner the following Sunday. Mr. Chen, who ran the general store, told Fletcher he had been meaning to ask about getting some specialized tools made. The seamstress who had made Felicity's dress introduced herself and mentioned that the school would likely need curtains for the windows. Through it all, Fletcher remained at Felicity's side, his hand at the small of her back, a steady, protective presence. She noticed how people seemed to regard him with new respect, as though his presence at church had somehow made him more approachable, more part of the community. Or perhaps, she thought, it was simply that they could see how he looked at her, the tenderness so evident in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Reverend Harris made his way over to them, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. "I hope you both found the service meaningful," he said, offering them the drinks. "Very much so," Felicity said, accepting a glass gratefully. The August heat was intense, even in the shade. "I meant what I said in my prayer," Reverend Harris continued, looking at Fletcher, "about community being strengthened when we welcome new members. You have been part of Desdemona for 5 years, Fletcher, but you have always kept yourself apart. I am glad to see you opening yourself to connection." Fletcher shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but he met the Reverend's eyes steadily. "Miss Lawson has shown me that isolation is not the same as strength," he said, "that maybe there is value in belonging to something larger than myself." "Wise words," Reverend Harris said approvingly. "I hope we will see you both here again next Sunday." "You will," Fletcher promised, and Felicity felt a rush of warmth at his certainty. As they walked back toward the boarding house later, the sun high overhead and the heat pressing down like a blanket, Felicity felt profoundly happy. The service had been everything she had hoped for, and more, and sharing that experience with Fletcher had created another layer of intimacy between them. "Will you come to dinner this evening?" she asked as they paused outside the boarding house. "Mrs. Whitmore always makes extra on Sundays." "I have a better idea," Fletcher said. "Let me take you to my cabin. I want to show you where I go when I need to escape the noise and crowds of town. It is about an hour's ride, and it will be cooler in the hills." Felicity hesitated. Going alone to a man's cabin was scandalous by any standard, especially for an unmarried woman. But she trusted Fletcher completely, and the thought of seeing the place that was so important to him appealed to her. "I would love that," she said. Fletcher's face lit up with pleasure. "I will get the horses ready and meet you back here in 20 minutes. Wear something practical if you have it." Felicity hurried upstairs and changed into her riding habit, one of the few items from her trunk that had survived the accident intact. It was burgundy wool, too heavy for the Texas heat, but the only option she had. She pinned her hair back securely and went back downstairs to find Fletcher waiting with 2 horses, a massive bay gelding for himself and a smaller, gentler mare for her. "Her name is Daisy," Fletcher said, helping Felicity mount. "She belonged to the previous blacksmith's wife, but when they moved back east, they left her with me. She needs regular exercise." Felicity settled into the saddle, grateful for the riding lessons her aunt had insisted upon back in Boston. Fletcher mounted his own horse with easy grace, and they set off at a comfortable walk, heading north out of Desdemona toward the distant hills. As they rode, the landscape gradually changed from flat, dusty plains to rolling terrain dotted with scrub oak and juniper. The temperature dropped slightly as they climbed in elevation, and Felicity felt some of the oppressive heat ease. Fletcher pointed out landmarks along the way, showing her a creek that ran year-round, a particular rock formation that meant they were halfway to his cabin, a grove of pecan trees where deer often gathered at dusk. "How often do you come out here?" Felicity asked, guiding Daisy around a fallen log. "At least once a week," Fletcher admitted. "Sometimes more if town starts to feel too confining. The solitude helps me think, helps me remember who I am beneath all the expectations and noise." "Will you still need that when you have me?" Felicity asked, then immediately wished she could take the words back. They sounded needy, demanding. But Fletcher reined in his horse and turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I will always need some solitude," he said honestly. "It is part of who I am. But Felicity, when I come out here now, all I do is wish you were with me. I want to share this part of my life with you. I want to show you the places that matter to me, the things that bring me peace." "I want that too," Felicity said softly. "I do not want to change you, Fletcher. I love who you are." The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Love. She had said it without thinking, but now that it was out there, she realized it was true. She loved this complicated, solitary man who had shown her such unexpected tenderness. Fletcher's eyes darkened with emotion. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough. "I have never said those words to anyone except my parents, and never to a woman. But I love you, Felicity Lawson. I think I have loved you since I caught you falling that first day." Tears streamed down Felicity's face, but she was smiling through them. "Then we are both very fortunate," she said. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, but everything felt different now, charged with the weight of declarations made. Fletcher's cabin appeared suddenly, nestled in a small valley between 2 hills, surrounded by live oak trees that provided shade and shelter. It was larger than Felicity had expected, built from sturdy logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch that ran the length of the front. Fletcher helped her dismount and tied the horses to a rail where they could reach a water trough. Then, he led her onto the porch and opened the door, gesturing for her to enter first. The interior was surprisingly tidy, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall, a well-made bed in one corner, and a table with 2 chairs near a window that looked out over the valley. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and various items Fletcher had clearly collected over the years. Interesting rocks, carved figures, what looked like Native American pottery. A bearskin rug covered part of the wooden floor, and cooking implements hung neatly near the fireplace. "It is wonderful," Felicity said, turning slowly to take it all in. "It feels like you." Fletcher looked pleased by her words. "I built most of it myself, with some help from my father before he died. It took 3 years to get it the way I wanted." He moved to the fireplace and began building a fire, despite the heat. "I want to make you coffee," he explained. "Real coffee, the way I make it in the mountains." Felicity explored while he worked, examining the books on his shelves. She found Shakespeare and Milton, but also practical guides to animal tracking and wilderness survival. There were books on philosophy and history, worn volumes that had clearly been read many times. She picked up a small carved figure from one shelf, a remarkably detailed wolf. "I made that during my first winter alone after my father died," Fletcher said, looking up from the fire. I needed something to do with my hands while I processed my grief. It is beautiful, Felicity said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. You have so many talents, Fletcher. He stood, dusting his hands on his trousers, and crossed to where she stood. Most men would say those talents are worthless, he said. Carving wooden animals does not put food on the table or shoes on horses. Most men are fools, Felicity said firmly. Your talents show who you are as a person, thoughtful, patient, creative, observant. Those qualities matter far more than whether you can make small talk at parties or know which fork to use at a formal dinner. Fletcher pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest. How did I get so lucky as to find you? He murmured into her hair. I think I am the lucky one, Felicity replied. You saved my life, Fletcher, in more ways than one. They stayed like that for a long moment, simply holding each other, before the coffee began to boil and Fletcher had to attend to it. He poured them both cups of the strong, bitter brew, and they sat on the porch together, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Tell me what you want for your future, Fletcher said suddenly. Not what you think you should want or what others expect. What do you truly want? Felicity considered the question carefully. I want to teach, she said slowly. I want to help children learn and grow and discover possibilities they might not otherwise know exist. I want to build a life somewhere that feels like home, surrounded by people I care about. She paused, gathering courage. And I want a family of my own someday. I want children and a partner who loves me, who sees me for who I truly am. I see you, Fletcher said quietly, and I love what I see. Felicity turned to look at him. What do you want, Fletcher? He was quiet for a long time, staring out over the valley as he formulated his answer. I want land, he said finally. Enough land that I can breathe, that I can build something lasting. I want to wake up each morning next to someone who understands me, who does not try to change me into something I am not. I want children too, sons and daughters I can teach to be strong and independent and kind. He looked at her then, his gray eyes intense. And I want all of that with you, if you will have me. Felicity's heart hammered in her chest. Are you asking me to marry you? Not yet, Fletcher said, surprising her. We have known each other for barely 3 weeks, and you deserve a proper courtship. I want time for you to be absolutely certain, time for us to build something solid. But I am telling you my intentions, Felicity. I am telling you that I am courting you with marriage in mind, that when I look at you, I see my future wife. I see my future husband when I look at you, Felicity said, her voice thick with emotion. But you are right. We should take our time, do this properly. I want to be certain, and I want you to be certain too. I am already certain, Fletcher said, but I will wait as long as you need. They stayed at the cabin until dusk began to fall, talking about their dreams and plans. Fletcher told her about the land he wanted to buy, a larger piece of property further into the hills where he could have both solitude and enough space for horses and possibly cattle. Felicity told him about her vision for the school, about teaching not just reading and arithmetic, but also music and art, about creating a place where children felt safe to learn and grow. When they finally rode back to Desdemona, the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Fletcher took her hand as they rode side by side, and Felicity felt a profound sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be. The next weeks and months unfolded in a pattern that felt both exciting and comfortably domestic. Felicity opened her school in early September, starting with 8 students whose ages ranged from 6 to 13. Fletcher had finished building all the desks and benches, and had even created a beautiful wooden frame for the slate blackboard. The students adored him on the rare occasions when he stopped by, awed by his size and strength, and Felicity loved watching him interact with them, seeing the gentleness he brought to every exchange. Their courtship proceeded slowly but steadily. Fletcher took her to Sunday services every week without fail, and his presence at church became expected rather than remarkable. They attended community gatherings together, and people grew accustomed to seeing them as a couple. Fletcher was still not particularly social, but he made an effort for Felicity's sake, and she loved him all the more for it. He took her riding in the hills every Sunday afternoon after church, showing her more of the landscape he loved. They had picnics by the creek and explored canyon paths that Fletcher had discovered years ago. He taught her to identify animal tracks and predict weather changes, sharing the wilderness knowledge his father had passed down to him. Felicity taught him about literature and poetry, reading aloud to him while he worked on carving projects or repairing tack. Mrs. Whitmore watched their relationship develop with obvious approval, often leaving them alone in the boarding house parlor in the evenings, trusting Fletcher's honor and Felicity's good sense. They would sit together on the worn sofa, sometimes talking, sometimes reading in comfortable silence, always with some point of contact between them, his hand holding hers, her head resting on his shoulder, their knees touching. Fletcher kissed her often, sweet kisses that gradually deepened into something more passionate as the weeks passed. But he was always careful to maintain propriety, always stopped before things went too far. "When I make you mine completely," he told her one evening as they sat in the twilight on the boarding house porch, "it will be as my wife, in our own home, with nothing but time and privacy ahead of us." By the time October arrived, painting the Texas landscape in shades of gold and rust, Felicity could not imagine her life without Fletcher in it. They had fallen into rhythms and routines that felt like marriage already. Him walking her to school each morning before heading to his forge, sharing lunch together when his work allowed, spending evenings planning and dreaming about their future. "I found land," Fletcher told her one Sunday in late October as they rode toward his cabin. 300 acres about 5 miles north of here, with a good creek running through it and enough trees for shelter. The owner is willing to sell for a fair price." Felicity's heart leaped. "That's wonderful. Will you buy it?" Fletcher reined in his horse and turned to face her fully. "That depends on your answer to a question I have been wanting to ask for weeks now." He dismounted and came to stand beside Daisy, looking up at Felicity with an expression so vulnerable it made her throat tight. Then, to her shock, he dropped to one knee right there in the dusty trail. "Felicity Lawson," he said, his deep voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his face. "I love you more than I have words to express. You have brought light and purpose into my life, and I cannot imagine facing a single day without you. I know I am rough around the edges, that I am better with horses than people, that I will never be refined or sophisticated, but I promise to love you with everything I am, to protect you and cherish you and build a life with you that honors us both." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring set with a small sapphire. "Will you marry me?" Felicity was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she looked down at this incredible man offering her his heart. "Yes," she managed to say through her tears. "Yes, Fletcher, I will marry you. I love you so much." Fletcher surged to his feet and pulled her down from the saddle into his arms, kissing her with a passion and joy that took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, he slipped the ring onto her finger, and Felicity saw that it fit perfectly. "It was my mother's," Fletcher said softly. "The only thing I have of hers. My father gave it to me before he died, said I should save it for the woman who captured my heart completely. I had it sized based on your glove size. Mrs. Whitmore helped with that." Felicity looked at the ring through her tears, touched beyond measure by the significance of the gift. "I will treasure it always," she promised, "just as I will treasure you." They rode the rest of the way to Fletcher's cabin in a state of euphoric happiness, making plans and dreaming aloud. Fletcher wanted to marry soon before winter set in, and Felicity agreed. They would have a simple ceremony at the church, she decided, with Reverend Harris officiating and the whole town invited to celebrate with them. And then I will build us a house on that land," Fletcher said as they sat together on his cabin porch, Felicity nestled against his side. "A real house, bigger than this cabin, with room for children and a proper kitchen and windows that look out over the hills. It will take time, but I will make it perfect for you." "Anywhere with you is perfect," Felicity said, meaning it with her whole heart. They were married on the first Sunday in November, just over 3 months after Felicity had stumbled into Desdemona, half dead from heat and exhaustion. The church was packed with well-wishers, and Felicity wore a dress of ivory silk that the town's women had helped sew as a wedding gift. Fletcher stood at the altar in a new black suit that emphasized his powerful build, his hair freshly trimmed but still long enough to brush his collar, his eyes fixed on Felicity as she walked down the aisle. Reverend Harris performed a beautiful ceremony, speaking about the way God brings people together in unexpected ways, about the strength found in partnership and the joy of building a life together. When Fletcher said his vows, his voice was rough with emotion but steady, promising to love and honor Felicity for all his days. Felicity's own vows came from her heart, promising to stand beside him through whatever life brought, to cherish him for exactly who he was. When Reverend Harris pronounced them husband and wife, Fletcher kissed her with such tender passion that several people in the congregation sighed audibly. The kiss went on longer than was probably proper for a church setting, but no one seemed to mind. When they finally broke apart, both flushed and beaming, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. The reception was held at the boarding house, with tables set up in the yard overflowing with food that the townspeople had contributed. There was dancing to music, provided by Mr. Chen's fiddle and Sheriff Daniel's surprisingly skilled harmonica playing. Fletcher danced with Felicity despite his protestations that he had never learned how, holding her close and moving with a natural grace that belied his size. As the sun set and the celebration continued around them, Fletcher pulled Felicity aside. "Are you ready to see your wedding gift?" he asked, his eyes dancing with barely contained excitement. "I thought the ring was my gift," Felicity said, confused. "That was my proposal gift," Fletcher corrected. "I have something else for you." He led her to where 2 horses stood saddled and ready, her trunk already secured to one of the pack animals. "We are going to the cabin tonight," he explained, "but that is not the gift. The gift is what you will see tomorrow morning." The ride to the cabin in the darkness was romantic and slightly surreal, with moonlight illuminating the trail and the sounds of night creatures accompanying them. When they arrived, Fletcher carried Felicity over the threshold, a tradition he had learned about from one of his books, and set her down gently in the middle of the cabin. He had transformed the space. Candles glowed on every surface, casting warm light throughout the room. The bed had new linens, thick and soft, and wildflowers filled every container he owned. A fire crackled in the hearth, taking the chill off the November night. "Fletcher," Felicity breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. "It is beautiful." "Not as beautiful as you," he said, moving to stand behind her. His hands came to rest on her shoulders, and she felt him begin unfastening the buttons that ran down the back of her dress. "I have waited so long for this," he murmured against her ear, "for the right to touch you, to love you completely." Felicity turned in his arms, reaching up to cup his bearded face in her hands. "Then do not wait any longer," she whispered. Their wedding night was everything Felicity had hoped for, and more. Fletcher loved her with the same intensity and focus he brought to everything else, learning what brought her pleasure with patient attention. He was gentle despite his strength, reverent despite his passion, and when they finally lay tangled together in the aftermath, Felicity felt complete in a way she never had before. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, her head resting on his chest as his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I love you too," Fletcher rumbled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "My wife." Felicity smiled at the possessive satisfaction in his voice. "My husband," she said, testing out the words and finding them perfect. The next morning, Fletcher woke her before dawn, urging her to dress warmly. Still sleepy but curious, Felicity complied, and they rode out into the pre-dawn darkness. After about 20 minutes, Fletcher stopped on a ridge overlooking a beautiful valley. "This is our land," he said softly, gesturing to the expanse below them. "All of it. I bought it last week with the money I've been saving for years. I wanted it to be official before we married, so you would know that I can provide for you properly." As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and orange, Felicity could see the full scope of what Fletcher had bought. The valley was lush with grass and dotted with trees, with a creek cutting through the center that caught and reflected the morning light. It was breathtakingly beautiful, wild and untamed, but full of potential. "I am going to build our house there," Fletcher said, pointing to a slight rise near the creek. "Close enough to water, but high enough to avoid flooding. There's good grazing for horses and cattle, plenty of game in the hills, and enough timber to build whatever we need." "It is perfect," Felicity said, tears streaming down her face for what felt like the 100th time in the past few days. "Absolutely perfect." They sat together on that ridge, watching the sun rise over their land, planning and dreaming about the future they would build together. Fletcher wanted to start construction on the house immediately, working on it every spare moment he had. Felicity suggested they could live in the cabin while the house was being built, making the daily ride into Desdemona for her teaching and his blacksmith work. Actually, Fletcher said carefully, I've been thinking about that. What if I taught someone else to run the smithy? Maybe took on an apprentice I could train? Then I could focus on building our house and starting our ranch. We have enough savings to manage for a while, and once we have horses to sell, the ranch will support us. Is that what you truly want? Felicity asked, searching his face. What I truly want is to build something lasting with you, Fletcher said. The smithy was always just a way to make money and have a reason to stay near civilization. But this land, this ranch, this life we are creating together, that is what I want to pour myself into. Then that is what we will do, Felicity said firmly. I make enough from teaching to cover our basic needs, and if we are careful, we can make it work. Over the next months, they settled into their life together with remarkable ease. They lived in the cabin during the week, rising before dawn so Fletcher could ride Felicity into town for school before returning to work on their house. He had found a young man named Thomas to apprentice at the smithy, teaching him the trade while gradually stepping back from the daily work himself. The house took shape slowly but steadily. Fletcher worked with the same meticulous care he brought to everything, building walls that were straight and true, fitting windows that would let in maximum light, constructing a stone fireplace that would heat the main room efficiently. Felicity helped when she could, holding boards in place or mixing mortar, treasuring these hours of working side by side with her husband. Their first winter together was cold but magical. They would huddle together in the cabin during snowstorms, reading aloud to each other or simply talking for hours. Fletcher taught Felicity to cook over an open fire, and she proved to be a quick study, soon producing meals that were simple but delicious. They made love frequently, learning each other's bodies with growing confidence and passion, and Felicity had never felt more alive or cherished. By the time spring arrived in 1874, bringing wildflowers and new growth to the land, their house was nearly complete. It was larger than the cabin, with 2 main rooms downstairs, a living area and a kitchen and a sleeping loft above that would eventually be divided into bedrooms for the children they both hoped for. Fletcher had built Felicity a real kitchen with a proper stove he had commissioned from a friend in San Antonio, and he had installed glass windows that caught the morning light beautifully. They moved into the house on a warm April evening, carrying their belongings from the cabin to their new home. That night, they christened every room, making love with joyful abandon now that they had true privacy and space. Afterward, lying in their new bed in the sleeping loft, looking up through the skylight Fletcher had installed so they could see the stars, Felicity felt a happiness so profound it almost frightened her. "What are you thinking?" Fletcher asked, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. "That I'm almost afraid to be this happy," Felicity admitted. "That surely something will happen to take it all away." Fletcher turned her to face him, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Life has no guarantees," he said quietly. "I know that better than most. But Felicity, whatever happens, whatever challenges we will face them together. That is what matters. Not that nothing bad will ever happen, but that we have each other to rely on when it does." "When did you become so wise?" Felicity asked, touching his face tenderly. "When I fell in love with a woman who sees the best in me," Fletcher replied, then kissed her until all her fears melted away. In June, Felicity discovered she was pregnant. She told Fletcher on a Sunday evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His face transformed with wonder and joy, and he pulled her into his arms with such careful reverence as though she were made of spun glass. "A baby," he whispered, his large hand splayed across her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Felicity asked, even though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Fletcher said roughly, "terrified and elated and grateful and a dozen other things I cannot name. You are giving me a family, Felicity. You are giving me everything." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Felicity found the Texas summer heat nearly unbearable in her condition. Fletcher was endlessly attentive, bringing her cool water from the creek, fanning her on the hottest afternoons, taking over more and more of the household tasks as she grew heavier and more tired. He talked to her belly constantly, telling their unborn child about the ranch and the horses and all the things they would do together. In February of 1875, during a cold snap that had everyone huddling close to their fires, Felicity went into labor. Fletcher rode into Desdemona to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered most of the babies in the area for the past 20 years. He refused to leave Felicity's side during the labor, holding her hand and offering encouragement, even when she cursed him for getting her into this condition. Their son was born just after dawn, coming into the world with a loud cry that proclaimed his arrival to anyone within earshot. Fletcher wept openly when Mrs. Patterson placed the baby in his arms, this tiny, perfect human that he and Felicity had created together. "He is beautiful," Fletcher said, his voice thick with emotion. "He looks like you." "He has your eyes," Felicity said, exhausted but euphoric. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months but never reached a firm decision. Now, looking at their son, Fletcher said quietly, "What about Franklin? It was my father's name. Franklin James Grant." "Franklin," Felicity repeated, testing it out. "Frankie for short. I love it." Little Frankie proved to be a healthy, hungry baby who rarely cried and seemed content as long as he could see or hear his parents. Fletcher was a natural father, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor at night when Frankie was fussy, singing to him in that deep, rumbling voice that seemed to soothe the baby instantly. Watching her husband with their son, Felicity fell in love with Fletcher all over again. He was so gentle with Frankie, so patient and attentive, that it made her heart ache. This man who had lived alone for so much of his life, who had once thought he would never have a family, had transformed into a devoted husband and father. The years that followed were full and rich, marked by both challenges and joys. The ranch grew steadily as Fletcher's reputation for breeding quality horses spread throughout Texas. They acquired cattle as well, building their herd slowly but surely. Money was sometimes tight, but they always had enough, and the satisfaction of building something from nothing made the struggles worthwhile. Felicity continued teaching for several more years, bringing Frankie with her to school when he was small, and eventually enrolling him when he was old enough. Fletcher built on an addition to the house, creating proper bedrooms downstairs and expanding the loft into a real second floor. He also built a barn and stable, a chicken coop, and various other outbuildings as the ranch required. Their family expanded as well. A daughter, Florence May, was born in 1877, with Felicity's dark hair and Fletcher's gray eyes. Then came another son, Frederick, in 1880, who inherited his father's size and strength even as a baby. With each child, Felicity marveled at Fletcher's capacity for love, at the way his heart seemed to grow to encompass each new person without diminishing what he felt for the others. Sunday church services remained a constant in their lives. Fletcher never missed a Sunday unless illness or emergency prevented it, and the children grew up understanding that Sunday mornings were for worship and community. Reverend Harris, growing older but no less passionate about his calling, often commented that Fletcher's faithful attendance had inspired other men in the community to be more regular in their own church-going. On their 10th anniversary in 1883, Fletcher surprised Felicity by taking her back to the ridge where he had first shown her their land. The valley below had been transformed, dotted now with their house and barn, fences marking pastures where horses grazed peacefully. It looked prosperous and established, a far cry from the wild, empty space it had been. "Remember when I brought you here that first morning?" Fletcher asked, his arm around her waist as they stood together watching the sunset. "I remember everything about our early days together," Felicity said softly. "How frightened I was that first Sunday we went to church, how you held my hand through the entire service." "I was terrified," Fletcher admitted with a quiet laugh. "I had never been inside a church before, had no idea what to expect, but having you beside me made it bearable, made it meaningful." "You have given me such a beautiful life," Felicity said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Sometimes I still cannot believe how fortunate I am that the stagecoach overturned when it did, that I stumbled into Desdemona instead of some other town." "Not fortune," Fletcher corrected gently. "Providence. We were meant to find each other, Felicity. I believe that with everything in me." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky and stars begin to emerge. From the house below, they could hear their children's voices raised in some game or argument, the sounds of family life that had become the soundtrack to their existence. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Felicity asked suddenly. The solitude? The simplicity of it? Fletcher considered the question seriously before answering. Sometimes I miss the quiet, he admitted. There are moments when the children are loud and demanding, when ranch business is complicated, when town politics frustrate me, that I remember the peace of those mountain cabins. But then I look at you, at our children, at everything we have built together, and I would not trade a single moment of this life for all the solitude in the world. You taught me that being alone is not the same as being at peace. Real peace comes from love, from connection, from belonging to something larger than yourself. Felicity turned in his arms, reaching up to cup his bearded face in her hands. I love you, she said simply, more now than even on the day we married. And I love you, Fletcher replied, kissing her with the same passion and devotion he had shown her from the very beginning. As the years continued to pass, their lives settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and constantly evolving. The children grew, each developing their own distinct personalities. Frankie inherited his father's love of horses and natural skill with animals. Florence showed a talent for music and a gentle spirit that endeared her to everyone she met. Frederick, the youngest, was adventurous and fearless, keeping his parents on constant alert as he climbed trees and explored every corner of the ranch. Fletcher expanded his land holdings over the years, buying adjacent properties as they became available until the Grant Ranch was one of the largest in the area. He hired help when needed, but remained actively involved in every aspect of the operation. Felicity eventually stopped teaching at the town school when Frederick was born, instead focusing on educating her own children and helping to manage the business side of the ranch. They faced challenges, of course. There was a drought in 1886 that tested everyone's resolve, forcing difficult decisions about livestock and water resources. Fletcher's quiet strength and careful planning saw them through, though it was a lean year. There were illnesses and accidents, the normal trials of ranch life that required resilience and faith. Through it all, their love remained the foundation everything else was built upon. They still made time for each other, stealing moments alone when they could, maintaining the intimacy and connection that had brought them together. Fletcher still looked at Felicity with the same intensity he had shown that first day, and she still felt her heart skip when he walked into a room. On Sunday mornings, the Grant family would arrive at church together, Fletcher and Felicity with their 3 children scrubbed and dressed in their Sunday best. They would take their customary pew near the back, the same one they had chosen on their very first Sunday together all those years ago, and Fletcher would hold Felicity's hand through the entire service, just as he had from the beginning. Reverend Harris, now quite elderly and training a younger man to eventually take over, often mentioned the Grants as an example of what a godly marriage should look like. Their devotion to each other and their family, their regular attendance and active participation in church life, their generosity toward those in need, all marked them as pillars of the community. By 1890, as Fletcher approached 40 and Felicity her mid-30s, their children were growing into young people with their own dreams and ambitions. Frankie, at 15, worked beside his father on the ranch and showed every sign of being ready to take over the operation someday. Florence, at 13, had become the unofficial music director at church, her beautiful voice leading the congregation in hymns each Sunday. Frederick, at 10, was still wild and energetic, but showed signs of the same intelligence and determination that characterized both his parents. On a warm spring evening, as Felicity and Fletcher sat on their porch watching the sunset after another long day, Fletcher pulled her close against his side. "Do you remember," he said softly, "that first Sunday we went to church together? How nervous we both were." "I remember," Felicity said, smiling at the memory. "You squeezed my hand so hard during the opening prayer that I thought my fingers might break." Fletcher laughed, the sound rich and warm. "I was terrified I would do something wrong, offend God or embarrass you. I had never been inside a church before in my entire life." "And now you are the one who reminds us all not to be late," Felicity teased gently. "The children know better than to dawdle on Sunday mornings when Father is ready to go." "It matters to me," Fletcher said seriously, "not just the church part, though I have come to value that more than I ever expected, but the tradition of it, the ritual of our family coming together every week to acknowledge something larger than ourselves. I want our children to grow up with that foundation, that sense of belonging to a community of faith." "You have become quite the philosopher," Felicity observed, pressing a kiss to his jaw. "I have had a good teacher," Fletcher replied, turning to capture her lips with his own. Their kiss deepened, and even after 17 years of marriage, Felicity felt the same spark, the same rush of desire and love that she had experienced from the very beginning. Fletcher pulled back first, his breathing slightly ragged. "I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every day with you is a gift I never thought I would receive." "And I love you," Felicity replied, her hand coming up to rest over his heart, feeling its steady beat beneath her palm. "You took a lost, frightened woman and gave her a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Fletcher corrected gently. "That is what partnership means." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, they sat together in the comfortable silence that only comes from years of shared life. From inside the house, they could hear the children getting ready for bed, Frederick arguing with Florence about something, while Frankie's deeper voice intervened with the patience he had learned from his father. "Do you ever think about that stagecoach accident?" Felicity asked suddenly. "About how different things might have been if it had not happened?" "All the time," Fletcher admitted. "If you had made it to San Antonio, you would probably be married to some banker or merchant by now, living in a fancy house with servants." "And I would be miserable," Felicity said firmly, "because I would not have you. I would not have this life we have built together. That accident was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though it did not feel like it at the time." Fletcher pulled her closer, and they sat wrapped in each other's arms as the night deepened around them. The ranch had quieted for the evening, horses settled in their stalls, cattle bedded down in the pastures, chickens roosting safely in their coop. Everything was peaceful, orderly, the result of years of hard work and careful stewardship. "I am proud of what we have built here," Fletcher said quietly. "Not just the physical ranch, though, that matters, but our family, our reputation, our place in the community. We started with nothing but determination and love, and look what we have created." "We have been blessed," Felicity agreed, "and we have worked hard to be worthy of those blessings." The conversation was interrupted by Florence calling from inside, asking her mother for help with something. Felicity sighed and stood, pressing one more kiss to Fletcher's lips before heading inside. Fletcher remained on the porch a while longer, looking out over the land that had become so much more than property to him. This ranch represented his transformation from a solitary mountain man to a husband, father, and community member. Every fence post, every building, every tree had been placed with thought and care. But more importantly, this land was where he had learned to open his heart, to trust in love, to believe that he could be part of something larger than himself. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenge. Frankie grew into a strong, capable young man who took over more and more of the ranch operations, allowing Fletcher to slow down slightly as he aged. Florence married a young rancher from a neighboring property, and their wedding was the social event of the season, held at the church with Reverend Harris officiating his final ceremony before retiring. Frederick showed an aptitude for business and began exploring opportunities to expand the ranch's commercial operations. Through it all, Sunday church services remained the cornerstone of the family's week. Even as the children grew and started families of their own, they returned home for Sunday worship, gathering at the church that had become such an important part of their lives. Fletcher, his hair now streaked with gray and his beard more white than brown, still sat in that same pew, still held Felicity's hand through the entire service. On their 25th anniversary in 1898, the entire town of Desdemona came together to celebrate the couple who had become such an integral part of the community. There was a party after church services, with food and music and speeches honoring their enduring love and their contributions to the town. Reverend Harris's successor, a young man named Pastor Williams, spoke about the example the Grants had set for godly marriage. "I have heard the story many times," he said to the assembled crowd, about how Fletcher had never been inside a church before the day he and Felicity attended their first Sunday service together. They were both nervous, both uncertain, but they faced that uncertainty together, hand in hand. That spirit of partnership, of facing life's challenges together in faith, has defined their marriage from that day to this. Fletcher, uncomfortable with being the center of attention but willing to endure it for Felicity's sake, stood and offered his own brief speech. "I'm not good with words," he began, his deep voice carrying easily across the crowd. "But I want to say this. 25 years ago, I was a man who thought he knew what life was about. I thought strength meant being alone, that independence was the highest goal. Then a woman stumbled into my town, injured and lost, and everything changed. Felicity taught me that real strength comes from connection, from commitment, from choosing to love someone every single day, even when it is hard. She took a rough mountain man and showed him what it meant to be part of a family, part of a community, part of something sacred. I am grateful for every moment we have shared, and I look forward to whatever years God grants us together." There was not a dry eye in the crowd when he finished, and Felicity found herself crying happy tears as Fletcher pulled her into his arms for a kiss that was probably inappropriate for a church gathering, but that no one seemed to mind. As they grew older together, Fletcher and Felicity fell into new rhythms. They handed over more of the ranch operations to their children, taking on advisory roles rather than doing the physical work themselves. They traveled some, visiting places they had always wanted to see, but they always returned home to their ranch, their community, their church. Sunday mornings remained special, a time when the entire extended Grant family would gather for worship. Fletcher, now in his 60s with completely white hair and a beard that gave him the look of a patriarch, still sat in that familiar pew with Felicity beside him. Their children and grandchildren filled the rows around them, a testament to the family they had built together. One Sunday morning in the spring of 1905, as they sat together listening to Pastor Williams's sermon about the faithfulness of God through all seasons of life, Fletcher leaned over and whispered in Felicity's ear, "Do you remember our first Sunday here? How scared we both were." Felicity smiled and squeezed his hand, that same hand that had held hers through countless Sunday services over more than 30 years. "I remember," she whispered back. "Best decision we ever made." "Second best," Fletcher corrected quietly. "The best was when you agreed to marry me." After the service, as they stood in the churchyard visiting with friends and family, Felicity watched Fletcher interact with his grandchildren. He was teaching the youngest, a little girl of about 5, how to identify different types of clouds, pointing up at the sky and explaining patiently. The child looked up at him with adoration, hanging on every word from her beloved grandfather. This, Felicity thought, was the true measure of a life well lived. Not wealth or prestige, though they had achieved a measure of both. Not even the physical ranch they had built, impressive as it was. The true measure was in these relationships, these connections that would extend beyond their own lives through their children and grandchildren. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching yet another sunset over the land they loved, Felicity rested her head on Fletcher's shoulder. "We did good, did we not?" she asked softly. "We did better than good," Fletcher replied, his arm around her waist. "We built something that will last, something that matters. Our children know how to work hard and love deeply. Our grandchildren are growing up with strong foundations of faith and family. The ranch is prosperous and will support generations to come. But most importantly, we loved each other well. We kept our promises." "All because a stagecoach overturned on a dusty Texas road," Felicity mused. "All because we were brave enough to take a chance on each other," Fletcher corrected. "That first Sunday, walking into that church together, neither of us knowing what to expect, but willing to try because we had each other. That set the pattern for everything that followed." "I would do it all again," Felicity said firmly. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy, all of it." "So would I," Fletcher agreed, pulling her closer. "Every single day I would choose you, choose this life, choose us." As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared, they sat together in the peaceful silence of long companionship. The ranch was quiet around them, settled for the night. Inside the house, they could hear their youngest grandchildren being put to bed, their voices raised in the evening prayers their parents taught them. This was their legacy, Felicity realized. Not just land or livestock, not even the strong children they had raised. Their legacy was love, demonstrated daily through commitment and sacrifice, through showing up for each other and for their community, through keeping faith with God and with each other no matter what challenges arose. Fletcher must have been thinking similar thoughts because he said quietly, "When I die, I want to be remembered as a man who kept his word, who loved his wife well, who honored God in his daily life. That is all that matters in the end." "You are already all of those things," Felicity assured him, "and you will be remembered for them long after we are both gone." They sat together until full darkness fell, neither willing to break the peaceful mood. Finally, Fletcher stood and offered Felicity his hand, pulling her to her feet with the same gentle strength he had always shown. They walked inside together, hand in hand, ready to face another night and another day together, just as they had been doing for over 30 years. The years that remained to them were good ones. They grew old together with grace, supporting each other through the inevitable ailments and losses that come with age. They celebrated grandchildren's weddings and the births of great-grandchildren. They watched their ranch continue to prosper under their children's management. And every Sunday morning, without fail, they attended church services together, sitting in that same pew, holding hands just as they had on that very first Sunday so many years ago. Fletcher passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1912 at the age of 61. He had spent his final day doing what he loved, working alongside his sons and grandsons on ranch repairs, coming home to Felicity for dinner, and an evening on the porch, talking about their plans for spring. When she found him the next morning, he looked peaceful, a slight smile on his weathered face, as though he had died dreaming happy dreams. The funeral was attended by nearly everyone in the county. People came from miles around to pay their respects to the man who had become legendary for his strength, his integrity, and his devotion to his family. Pastor Williams spoke about Fletcher's journey from solitary mountain man to beloved husband, father, and community member, about how love had transformed him and how his example had inspired others. Felicity, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, listened to the tributes with a mixture of grief and gratitude. She had lost her partner, her best friend, the love of her life. But she had been blessed to have him for as long as she did, to build a life and family with him that would endure long after they were both gone. She lived for another 8 years, remaining active in the church and ranch life until the very end. Her children and grandchildren cared for her tenderly, giving back a small measure of the love she had always poured into them. Every Sunday morning, she still attended church services, still sat in that familiar pew, though now her children sat on either side of her instead of Fletcher. When Felicity finally passed away in her sleep in 1920, at the age of 69, her family found a letter she had written to be read at her funeral. In it, she reflected on her life and the love that had defined it. "I came to Texas as a lost young woman with nothing but a torn dress and an injured ankle. I found in Fletcher Grant a man who showed me what real love looks like: patient, devoted, constant, and true." Our first Sunday together, walking into that church hand in hand, both of us nervous and uncertain, set the pattern for our entire life together. We faced everything hand in hand, supporting each other, trusting God to guide us, building something beautiful from nothing but determination and love. I have been blessed beyond measure. If you want to honor my memory, love your spouse well, cherish your children, serve your community, and never miss a Sunday at church. These simple things create a life of profound meaning. Fletcher and Felicity were buried side by side in the church cemetery, under a large oak tree that provided shade in summer and shelter in winter. Their grave marker was simple but meaningful: Fletcher and Felicity Grant, beloved husband and wife, devoted parents and grandparents, faithful servants of God, together always. The ranch continued to thrive under their descendants' management, and the Grant name became synonymous with quality horses and cattle throughout Texas. But more importantly, the values Fletcher and Felicity had instilled in their family endured. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren knew the story of how a mountain man who had never been inside a church took an injured stranger to Sunday services on their first week together, beginning a love story that would span decades and touch countless lives. Every year on the anniversary of that first Sunday, the Grant family would gather at the church for a special service of Thanksgiving, remembering the legacy of faith and love that had started so humbly so many years before. They would sit in those familiar pews, holding hands just as Fletcher and Felicity had done, honoring the memory of two people who had proven that real love, grounded in faith and demonstrated through daily commitment, could transform lives and create something that lasted far beyond a single lifetime. And so the story of the mountain man and the lost schoolteacher who found each other in the harsh Texas wilderness lived on, passed down through generations as an example of what love could accomplish when two people were brave enough to trust each other and faithful enough to keep showing up Sunday after Sunday, year after year, hand in hand through every season of life.